storms, or rebellions. Men coveted it. Women despised it. And in 1854, no woman was hated more fiercely than Marjorie, the slave girl whose face stirred jealousy like hornets in a shaken nest. Mistresses whispered that she ruined marriages simply by entering a room. Overseers complained that work slowed whenever she passed. Planter wives claimed their husbands' eyes followed her like hounds on scent. Rumors spread until they swallowed truth, that a single glance from Marjorie could sour a marriage bed, turn a man's loyalty brittle, make a woman feel and look less than whole. On the Rosewood plantation, the mistress, Eleanor Barrow, decided she would not be outshone. Beauty was her domain, her pride, her instrument of power. So when a girl she owned eclipsed her in whispers and stares, Eleanor's resentment grew into rot. Everyone knew it. Tragedy begins where envy festers, and Marjorie, quiet and watchful, felt the air tightening around her like a noose. She had broken no rules. She had spoken no charms. She only had the misfortune of a face that made other women see themselves more clearly and despise what they saw. But beauty cuts both ways, and Marjorie knew how to wield hers more sharply than any of them imagined. Marjorie never tried to be beautiful. Her mother had warned her, "Keep your gaze low. Beauty makes noise even when your lips do not." So Marjorie kept her eyes down, her movements soft, her steps feather-light as she walked the veranda carrying Eleanor Barrow's morning tray. The sun hadn't fully risen. Dew still clung to the railing like pearls. Marjorie placed the tray carefully: tea, milk, honey, and the silver spoon Eleanor insisted be polished twice. "Late," Eleanor snapped without looking up from her mirror. Marjorie said nothing. She'd learned that answering only sharpened the mistress's irritation. Eleanor examined herself more than the food, tilting her head, smoothing her curls, pinching her cheeks for color. Her reflection didn't satisfy her. It hadn't in months, not since the whispers had begun. The first had come from a planter's wife during a supper gathering. "Who is that girl? The one pouring the wine? That face, Lord." The husband's silence afterward had been louder than words. It spread from there, tiny comments, glances, comparisons, and Eleanor, who had once been the belle of 2 counties, felt the shift like a thorn in her shoe she could never remove. Now she studied Marjorie the way one examines a snake, fascinated and furious. "Stand up straight," Eleanor ordered. "You slouch like you're hiding something." Marjorie straightened, though her instinct was to shrink. "You walk too lightly," Eleanor added. "It's deceptive. Makes men think you're soft." Marjorie lowered her eyes further. "Yes, ma'am. And your hair, why does it shine like that? What are you putting in it?" "Nothing," Marjorie said quietly. "Juice water." Eleanor's jaw twitched. Liar. She rose so quickly the mirror rattled. Circling Marjorie, she inspected her the way a jealous child inspects a rival's doll. Every detail burned her. The smoothness of the girl's skin, the long lashes casting shadows on her cheeks, the natural gloss of her lips. "You're doing something," Eleanor hissed, as if Marjorie's beauty were a deliberate attack. "Do you enjoy the way men look at you?" Marjorie shook her head. "No, ma'am." Eleanor's laugh was sharp. "You expect me to believe that?" She moved closer, invading the girl's space, forcing her chin up with a cold fingertip. "You cause trouble just by breathing." Marjorie's throat tightened. "I don't mean to, but you do." Eleanor released her with a flick, disgusted. "Get out of my sight." Marjorie obeyed, crossing the veranda as silently as air. But when she reached the steps, she felt at Eleanor's stare, stabbing her back with a force that made her spine stiffen. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Something was shifting, something Eleanor couldn't control. Down in the yard, field hands paused their work as Marjorie passed. Some nodded respectfully. Some looked away quickly, knowing even glances could be dangerous around a mistress as jealous as Eleanor Barrow. Old Nana Roo, who washed clothes beneath the willow tree, murmured as Marjorie approached, "Baby, the wind's changin'. I can smell trouble hittin' this place like a storm." Marjorie knelt beside her. "It ain't my fault." "It don't have to be," Nana said. "Jealous hearts don't need a reason, just a target." Marjorie swallowed hard. "She gettin' worse." "Oh, she been worse," Nana whispered. "You just startin' to see it." From the upstairs veranda, Eleanor's voice rang out again, calling for someone, shouting about something, her tone rising like heat from a fire. Marjorie looked up at the house. Nana Rue placed a wrinkled hand over hers. "Keep your steps careful, child. A woman who fear lozen her beauty? She dangerous. A woman who thinks she lost it already? She deadly." Marjorie felt her heartbeat quicken, because deep down, she knew. Eleanor Barrow had already decided something about her, and whatever it wasn't peace. The sun had barely risen over the Georgia horizon, yet the plantation already hummed with the low moans and footsteps of laboring slaves. They moved through the red clay, heavy with morning dew, carrying baskets of cotton and buckets of water, while the overseer's whip cracked in the distance, slicing the air with a sharpness that mirrored the tension woven through the rows. At the center of this silent storm, Amara's face held the kind of quiet command that demanded attention without a single word. It was not that she was tall, though she had a posture that made her appear regal. It was not that her skin was flawless, though its deep brown hue caught the light in an almost luminous way. It was the angles of her features, the eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's soul, and the way even the most confident mistress found herself shrinking under her gaze. Amara had learned long ago to walk the fine line between defiance and survival, understanding that her beauty was both her curse and her shield. Her morning began with the wash house, a cavern of steamy water and clattering tin basins. The other girls worked around her, whispering nervously about yesterday's events, how Mrs. Whitmore had entered the hall carrying a bundle of clothes, only to pause abruptly at the sight of Amara's reflection in the polished copper basin. The lady's face had twisted with something between disgust and fear, her eyes darting away as if the mirror itself had betrayed her. Some of the slaves had snickered, others had crossed themselves, murmuring prayers for their own souls. Amara, however, did nothing but dip the stiffened linens into the steaming water, wringing each one carefully before setting it aside. Her mind, sharp as a blade, replayed her own calculated plan, to make the plantation see what fear and respect could look like if wielded subtly, invisibly, like a shadow that always lingered at the edge of perception. The mistress's aversion was not new. It had begun shortly after Amara arrived as a child, too young to understand fully why men and women alike both desired and feared her presence. She had been sold in Charleston, her father's pride and shame alike packaged into a single chest, and now she carried that history like a silent weapon. Across the yard, the overseer barked orders, his voice rasping, fraying under the weight of suppressed panic. The other slaves hurried along the rows of cotton, their hands blistered, their fingers raw, but Amara's steps remained measured, purposeful. She allowed herself a moment to glance at the mistress's window, the pale lace curtains trembling slightly in the morning breeze. There was a shadow behind them, a shadow of the woman's trembling ego, and Amara recognized it for what it was, a fear born from her own insecurities, magnified by the presence of someone who could not be controlled by wealth, lineage, or cruel intent. Mid-morning brought the first confrontation. The mistress, elegant in her heavily starched gown, had descended the wide steps of the veranda with all the pomp her social class afforded. She approached Amara, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. "Amara," she said, voice clipped like broken glass, "do you intend to continue interrupting every social gathering? I have gentlemen coming to dine, and I cannot have your influence distracting them." Amara tilted her head slightly, her braid falling over one shoulder. She chose her words with deliberate care. "Mistress, I cannot help the way men respond. I merely exist, and it seems that is enough to make them uneasy." A twitch passed over the woman's face, a spasm of fury suppressed by the veneer of civility. "Enough to make them uneasy?" she snapped. "Do you know the rumors, girl? The stories whispered in Charleston, the talk at the markets? That you—" Amara interrupted gently, almost softly, but her voice carried a weight no amount of southern charm could dismiss. "I know what they say, mistress. I also know what I see. And I see that fear is a poor companion, but a wise one. Perhaps it teaches more than your lectures ever could." The air seemed to crackle in the wash house. The other slaves froze mid-motion, the buckets and washboards heavy in their hands. The mistress's lips trembled, a faint flush creeping across her pallid cheeks. No one spoke. The power balance, subtle as the ripple of a pond, had shifted. Amara's mind drifted briefly to the field, where the sun would soon scorch the soil and the cotton would sweat under the oppressive heat. She imagined the other slaves, their hands aching, their spines bending, yet their eyes flicking toward her for a hint of reassurance, a sign that someone dared to exist on her own terms, even within the iron bounds of this plantation. Her gaze returned to the mistress, whose expression now hovered between rage and awe. Amara allowed herself the tiniest hint of a smile, careful, controlled, imperceptible. This was her domain, not through overt rebellion, but through the quiet terror and fascination she inspired. Each day, each glance, each whispered tale added to the invisible web she wove. And it was growing, stretching outward from the washhouse, touching the veranda, the fields, even the minds of those who believed themselves untouchable. When the lady finally stormed away, slamming the door behind her, Amara dipped another linen into the water, serene and precise. A few of the younger slaves looked at her with awe, others with envy. But Amara understood the truth. It was not their opinions she needed, nor the gossip of Charleston's hidden markets. What mattered was survival, cunning, and the terrifying grace of being untouchable in a world designed to crush anyone like her. By mid-afternoon, whispers had begun to travel through the quarters. Slaves spoke of the Mistress Whitmore retreating from her own drawing room, her face pale as a ghost, while Amara moved among the linens as if the room itself belonged to her. They said the very air shifted in her presence, and no one dared question what power lay hidden beneath that quiet, inscrutable expression. Amara paused for a moment, listening to the rhythmic slap of water against the washboard, the distant shouts of men working the fields, and the soft laughter of young girls pretending to sweep in her direction. She allowed herself a small smile, knowing she had survived another morning without bending, without breaking, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Yes, her face was the one that ruined marriages, that unnerved mistresses and thrilled the hearts of those too naive to understand. But more importantly, it was a face that had learned to endure, to manipulate, and to command respect in a world that had long forgotten what justice might look like. And in that understanding, Amara found something the plantation could never take from her. The first glimmer of true freedom, hidden in plain sight. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the heat pressed down like a living thing, and the fields of cotton shimmered in waves under its gaze. Amara moved with the same measured grace she had always maintained, yet today there was an edge in her step, a careful wariness. Word of the morning's confrontation had traveled fast. Whispers followed her from the wash-house to the quarters, even into the overseer's office. Some called it fear, others called it awe. She didn't care which. The overseer, a wiry man named Jenkins, had been pacing the veranda since breakfast, trying to maintain the illusion of control. But the tension in his shoulders, the slight twitch in his eye whenever Amara passed, betrayed the truth. He knew she wielded a power he could not measure, one that existed outside of whips and chains, and he hated it. "Amara," Jenkins barked, attempting authority, though his voice faltered under the midday sun. "I need you to come sort the cotton with the others. We've got bales to finish before the inspector arrives." She lifted her head, eyes meeting his. For a moment, he thought he saw hesitation, but it was nothing of the sort. Her gaze was firm, and her lips held the faintest curve, a secret smile that hinted she knew more than she let on. "Yes, sir," she said, her tone neutral, yet every syllable carried a subtle power that made the hairs on his neck bristle. She moved toward the field, her skirts brushing the dirt, and the younger slaves shuffled aside, whispering among themselves. Amara had long understood that true influence did not come from force. It came from the perception of strength, the subtle suggestion that one could act with impunity if need be. The plantation was a chessboard, and she knew every square. In the field, the overseer barked more orders, but they felt hollow in the presence of her calm. As Amara bent to lift a basket, she noted the way the men in the field stole glances at her, their expressions flickering between fear and fascination. One by one, they returned to their work, unable to maintain eye contact for long. Her beauty was more than aesthetic. It was an aura of command, sharpened by the survival instincts honed over years of servitude. By mid-morning, the mistress herself appeared, walking along the veranda with a forced smile, attempting to assert her place in the invisible power struggle. She stopped abruptly, staring at Amara, and for the first time in weeks, she spoke aloud in the presence of the laboring slaves. "Amara," she said, voice trembling slightly despite the mask of composure. "Come here. I wish to speak with you." Amara paused, then moved toward the steps, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The slaves watched from the rows, sensing a rare event unfolding. Even Jenkins froze in place, unable to intervene without exposing his own insecurity. Once Amara reached the veranda, the mistress spoke again, softer this time, almost pleading. I cannot have the men distracted. You must understand, it is unseemly, improper, dangerous for everyone." Amara's eyes met hers steadily. "Mistress," she said quietly, "I do not seek to distract anyone. I simply exist, and if my presence causes such disruption, perhaps it is not I who am at fault." A hush fell over the veranda. The words, simple yet razor-sharp, cut through the tension like a blade. The mistress's lips trembled, her hands gripping the railing as though to anchor herself to reality. Amara allowed herself a brief, controlled smile, knowing she had achieved exactly what she intended, a subtle shift in power, one that would reverberate through the day and beyond. Returning to the fields, Amara noted the way the younger slaves now stole confident glances at her, some daring to mirror her expressions, testing the boundaries of the authority she embodied. She allowed them this small victory. It was, after all, a necessary part of the strategy. Those who served under her would learn that respect was earned, not demanded. And fear could be a tool, a shield, and a weapon all at once. By afternoon, the air was thick with heat, dust, and the hum of insects. Amara paused in the shade of a gnarled oak, her hands resting on a basket, breathing in the scent of the sun-baked earth. She thought of Charleston, of the markets and whispered rumors, and the journey that had brought her here. The path of a slave woman was narrow, but she had learned to navigate it with cunning, wit, and an unerring understanding of human nature. Jenkins approached cautiously, trying once more to assert control. "Miss Amara, you cannot spend the day idling. The men require guidance, and the bales—" She turned to him, her gaze piercing. "I am guiding them, Mr. Jenkins. Perhaps the only difference is that they follow willingly, not out of fear of the lash." His jaw tightened. He wanted to speak, to threaten, to regain authority, but he knew, deep down, he had lost. The plantation had shifted in subtle ways, and he could feel the cracks spreading through his carefully constructed hierarchy. As the day wore on, Amara continued her work, her mind already plotting the next subtle moves in the intricate dance she performed daily. She knew the mistress's fear would only deepen, that whispers of her presence would spread through the quarters and into the town. And she relished it, for in the shadows of power and desire, she had found her own space, a pocket of control where none could touch her. By the time the sun dipped low, casting long, trembling shadows across the red earth, Amara had achieved what she desired, the acknowledgement, subtle yet undeniable, that she was no ordinary slave. The plantation was hers to command in ways that could never be openly challenged, and she understood, finally, that power was not always seized with fists. It could be held in the quiet curve of a smile, the weight of a gaze, and the knowledge that some things, no matter how forcefully demanded, could never be taken. As twilight settled, she walked back to the quarters, the whispers following her like shadows. In those murmurs, she could hear respect, fear, envy, and awe, and she knew that the true work of domination had only just begun. The next morning, the plantation awoke to an uneasy quiet. Birds lingered in the trees, their usual morning songs subdued, and the fields seemed to sway more gently under the rising sun. Amara moved among the cotton stalks with the ease of one who belonged not only to the land but to its very rhythm, each step measured, deliberate. She had learned to command attention without raising her voice, and the air around her now hummed with a tension she could feel, a mixture of curiosity, fear, and grudging respect. Jenkins appeared early, pacing along the edge of the fields, muttering under his breath. His attempts at authority were growing desperate, his gestures sharper, his shouts more frequent, but Amara was undeterred. She had already anticipated his moves, each attempt at intimidation countered by her quiet confidence. She smiled faintly as she watched him flare, knowing that his frustration was the first sign of true recognition, the acknowledgement that she was no longer just a shadow in the quarters, no longer simply a tool to be managed. The mistress arrived soon after, this time with her daughters in tow. Their skirts brushed the red earth as they approached, eyes wide and lips pursed in a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The eldest daughter, a girl of 17, stared at Amara with a mixture of envy and disbelief. The younger, barely 14, looked on with quiet fascination, not yet understanding the complexities of the power she was witnessing. "Amara," the mistress called, her voice brittle. "I need you to assist us with the embroidery in the main house. We cannot have the guests waiting." Amara inclined her head, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am," she said, but inside, a slow, deliberate plan began to take shape. She would go to the house, but she would not simply follow orders. Every movement would be a statement, every gesture a subtle assertion of control. As she entered the grand hall, the guests were just arriving. Merchants, planters, and their wives filed in, laughing and trading pleasantries. Amara's presence shifted the room, a subtle disturbance in the carefully constructed social order. Heads turned, eyes lingered longer than polite custom allowed, and whispers rippled through the air like wind through the trees. Some were intrigued by her beauty, others unsettled by the confidence she exuded. The mistress, aware of the undercurrent, tried to position herself as the center of attention, but even her elaborate gown and carefully coiffed hair could not compete with the quiet magnetism of Amara. The girl's every gesture, from the adjustment of her embroidery frame to the measured placement of each stitch, radiated calm control, and the subtle defiance hidden in her eyes made the mistress's own authority seem brittle, fragile. Halfway through the afternoon, Amara was called to fetch water for a small gathering of men in the study. She complied, carrying the pitcher with steady hands, but the weight of the vessel was less significant than the weight of her presence. The men, planters, and overseers were distracted, their conversation faltering, eyes darting toward her in furtive acknowledgement. She allowed herself a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Power did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, it suggested, it lingered like the heat in the afternoon air. When the mistress attempted to assert dominance, Amara responded with gentle, polite compliance, but always with a hidden layer of subtle manipulation. She placed a napkin just so, poured water with perfect timing, and carried the smallest of gestures into the realm of influence. By the end of the day, even the mistress could not deny that the room had shifted in tone. The hierarchy had changed, subtly but irrevocably. As the sun sank low, casting a golden haze across the plantation, Amara walked to the veranda and looked out over the fields. The slaves in the distance paused, noticing her silhouette framed by the setting sun. In their eyes, she saw hope, fear, and a reflection of her own calculated dominance. The plantation had become a living chessboard, and every pawn, knight, and rook moved in response to her quiet strategy. That night, in the quarters, whispers spread like fire. Stories of Amara's subtle triumphs, of her ability to command attention and respect without a single overt act of defiance, traveled from one hut to the next. Even the elders, who had seen generations rise and fall, nodded to each other, recognizing the rare presence of someone who could wield influence without chains, who could bend the social order with nothing but the force of their own mind. Amara lay awake on the thin mattress, hands folded, eyes open. She thought of the mistress, of Jenkins, of the young slaves learning to navigate their world. Every action, every measured step, was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving, a tapestry not of submission, but of subtle power. By the time the first stars appeared in the southern sky, Amara understood something profoundly simple and terrifying. She had become untouchable in ways the plantation could not yet admit, and that realization brought a cold, thrilling clarity to her heart. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, a soft vow carried only by the night wind. Let them underestimate me. Let them forget that the strongest power is quiet, patient, and inevitable. The air settled, thick and humid, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a harmonica drifted across the fields. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her, knowing she had planted the seeds of change and that when they sprouted, no force on the plantation could contain them. The following morning, the plantation was already stirring with the usual clatter of life, yet there was a distinct tension threading through the air. Amara walked toward the fields, each step deliberate, her posture a study in composed strength. The other slaves noticed immediately her movements radiated control, not through intimidation, but through quiet assurance. The workmen exchanged glances, some whispering behind hands, others daring to linger a little too long near her path. She did not flinch or acknowledge them. Her presence alone carried authority. The overseer, Jenkins, had grown visibly agitated. He appeared early, pacing the edge of the cotton rows with a fury barely restrained. He barked orders with increased frequency, attempting to assert dominance. Yet Amara's calm disregard gnawed at him. The slaves followed her lead without instruction, intuitively understanding that she was the anchor of the day. Even the dogs seemed to respond differently, tilting their heads as if acknowledging her unspoken power. At midday, the mistress summoned her daughters, the eldest and the youngest, to demonstrate the day's chores and proper conduct for the visitors she expected later. They arrived in fine dresses, their expressions carefully rehearsed to show humility and decorum. Amara had anticipated this and had already positioned herself at the center of the yard, hands folded, a small bundle of cloth in her arms. She did not move when the mistress called. She merely inclined her head politely, signaling compliance without submission. The visitors arrived shortly after, their carriages rolling onto the red clay paths. Planters, merchants, and a few lawmen filed from the wagons, expecting to see a well-ordered plantation and polite, obedient slaves. They did not expect Amara. When she entered the main courtyard, the chatter stilled, conversations halted mid-sentence, and the air seemed to thicken. Her face, serene yet unmistakably sharp in its intensity, drew their gaze as naturally as a flame draws moths. One of the visitors, a merchant from Savannah, leaned slightly toward another and whispered, "Who is that girl? She commands the air itself." His companion frowned, unsure whether to feel intrigue or unease. Amara did not hear them, but she was aware of the power she radiated, aware that in this subtle, silent way, she had already begun to reshape the social hierarchy. Inside the main house, she moved with effortless grace, delivering trays of refreshments and attending to the smallest details with precision that left the guests impressed. A dropped napkin, a misaligned dish. Any mistake would have exposed weakness, but none appeared. Amara's movements were meticulous, each deliberate, creating an illusion of perfect compliance while quietly asserting dominance over the space. The mistress attempted to interject, to command the room, but the visitor's eyes, inevitably drawn to Amara, left her words falling flat. Later, when the elder daughter of the mistress attempted to correct Amara, her voice carried a sharpness she did not intend. "You should know your place, girl," she hissed, her hands trembling slightly. Amara turned her head ever so slightly, a soft, controlled gaze meeting the girl's, and replied in measured tones, "I know my place, ma'am. I also know yours." The words were subtle, the implication clear. The girl faltered, words dying in her throat. As the day waned, Amara stepped into the shadows near the veranda, observing the dynamics she had quietly altered. The visitors, captivated and unnerved by her presence, whispered among themselves. Some admired her poise, others recoiled at the ease with which she commanded attention. Jenkins, realizing that he could not reclaim authority without public humiliation, seethed quietly. The mistress, once the unquestioned center of this world, found herself struggling to maintain control over her own household. In the fields, the other slaves moved with renewed confidence. Amara's influence had become tangible, a guiding force without overt command. They exchanged subtle nods, small smiles, and glances that carried shared understanding. A quiet revolution had begun in these rows of cotton and clay, not with weapons or loud defiance, but with the deliberate, calculated assertion of presence. By evening, Amara returned to the quarters, her body tired but her mind sharper than ever. The younger slaves followed her silently, eyes wide, absorbing her every motion, every nuanced gesture. In the dim light of the wooden cabins, she spoke softly, recounting what had occurred that day, shaping their understanding of influence, respect, and survival. "They will try," she said, her voice steady and certain. "They will try to undermine us, to take what we've earned. But never forget, strength is quiet, patience is power, and strategy is survival. We are seen now. They will act, and we will act with them." A hush fell over the room, the weight of her words settling deep into each listener's heart. She had taken what seemed a simple day's work and transformed it into an intricate lesson in authority. Tonight, they understood something more profound. The fields themselves whispered her name, carrying the silent promise of change, the inevitability of her influence. Amara lay awake long into the night, listening to the hum of cicadas outside and the distant murmur of the plantation. Every creak of the boards, every sigh of the wind through the trees, spoke to her as if affirming the path she had chosen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at control by those who underestimated her, but she welcomed them. Each confrontation was an opportunity, each act of defiance by others a chance to demonstrate the quiet, inevitable power she now wielded. She closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her, knowing that she was no longer just a presence in the shadows. She was the pivot around which the plantation now turned, a force both seen and unseen, commanding attention not with fear alone but with the undeniable gravity of her being. And somewhere deep inside, a smile touched her lips, for the knowledge of what she could accomplish and what she would accomplish was entirely her own. The following morning brought a thick, humid heat that clung to the red clay and swaying cotton stalks. The plantation stirred with the usual clamor, but the tension from the previous day lingered like a shadow. Amara stepped out of the quarters before the sun had fully risen, her movements deliberate, each step measured. The air smelled of wet earth and faint smoke from the morning fires, a scent she found grounding. Jenkins, the overseer, appeared almost immediately, pacing along the fence line with restless energy. He watched her approach, frowning, his jaw tight. He had spent the night plotting, trying to devise ways to reclaim control after being humiliated in front of the visitors. But Amara did not react to his scrutiny. She had anticipated his agitation, and her calmness was a shield he could not pierce. As the slaves began their morning tasks, whispers circulated like a current. "She's untouchable," one murmured, bending over the cotton rows. "I've never seen anyone hold the room like that," another added, eyes wide. The younger girls in the cabin peeked out, seeking the reassurance that Amara's presence had become a constant source of courage. By mid-morning, the mistress appeared, draped in her finery, attempting to assert dominance. Her steps were crisp, her voice sharp, but even she could not command the attention of the assembly. Amara moved among the workers with an effortless grace, offering small gestures of guidance without speaking more than necessary. A slight tilt of the head, a nod of approval, a glance toward a misaligned row, her authority was transmitted silently, yet the impact was unmistakable. The eldest daughter of the mistress tried again, emboldened by her mother's presence. "Amara, see to this row. Do it properly," she demanded, her voice carrying both irritation and fear. Amara paused, letting the girl's words hang in the air before she replied softly, "It is being done, ma'am. Perhaps your eyes have yet to catch the details." The subtle insult did not go unnoticed. The girl flushed, her confidence faltering. The visitors from the day before who had lingered for an extended stay, now observing quietly, stifled their laughter and looked away, uncertain whether to admire or fear the woman who had so deftly shifted the balance of power on the plantation. Meanwhile, In the fields, the work continued, but the energy was different. Tasks were performed efficiently, without complaint, yet with a sense of silent defiance. Amara's presence alone inspired a quiet revolution. The workers were no longer merely executing orders, they were performing with intent, asserting a collective dignity even in the small, subtle gestures of labor. By noon, the sun was a relentless hammer over the rows of cotton, and Amara paused to catch her breath. She surveyed the plantation with sharp eyes, noting the nervous movements of the overseer and the mistress's daughters. Each misstep, each flicker of uncertainty, reinforced her sense of control. She had not raised her voice, nor struck fear with threats. Her mastery came from observation, from timing, and from understanding the psychology of those around her. Later, when the mistress attempted to gather the workers for instructions, Amara subtly shifted positions, moving through the crowd in a manner that commanded attention. Without a word, the whispers ceased. The plantation fell quiet, all eyes inadvertently drawn toward her. The mistress faltered, her instructions lost in the sudden focus that Amara naturally demanded. Even the overseer's confidence waned. His attempts to reassert authority fell flat, as if swallowed by the weight of Amara's presence. As the afternoon waned, Amara called a small group of younger slaves aside. "Observe closely," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "Every move, every word, carries weight. The world does not bend to anger or brute force alone. Power is subtle, power is quiet. Power is knowing when to act and when to wait." The children nodded, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and determination. They were learning that survival on this plantation, or in any place dominated by the powerful, required more than obedience. It required presence, intellect, and courage, all of which Amara exhibited in abundance. By evening, Amara returned to the quarters, sweat and dust clinging to her skin, yet her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She had faced another day under scrutiny, yet each challenge had been met with poise. She had observed, guided, and subtly shifted the balance of authority in her favor. As the plantation settled into the quiet of dusk, Amara stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching the sun sink behind the distant trees. She allowed herself a rare smile, understanding that her influence had grown. The overseer's frustration, the mistress's fear, the visitor's whispered astonishment, all were testaments to the quiet, inescapable power she now wielded. And somewhere deep within her, a plan was forming. Each day was a step, each observation a piece of a larger strategy. She would not merely endure the plantation, she would reshape it entirely, bending the hierarchy through patience, intellect, and the subtle assertion of her presence. The night air cooled the sweat on her skin, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Tomorrow would bring new trials, but Amara was ready. She had begun to understand the true meaning of power. It was not in force, nor in loud proclamation, it was in the quiet certainty that those around her could not ignore. As the stars emerged in the indigo sky, Amara closed her eyes and whispered a vow. "I will be seen, I will be known, and no one will forget my presence." The dawn arrived with a thin, hazy light that filtered through the tall pines surrounding the plantation. Amara rose before the sun fully emerged, her body aching from the work of the previous days, yet her mind was sharp, awake, and ready. The events of yesterday had shifted something on the plantation, an invisible current in which her presence carried authority. She moved silently through the cabins, observing the younger slaves as they began their morning chores. They glanced at her with a mixture of awe and expectation, waiting for her subtle guidance, knowing that her approval meant something far deeper than the overseer's commands. She offered a quiet nod here, a gentle tilt of the head there, and they responded, aligning themselves instinctively. The overseer, Jenkins, appeared before the fields, a scowl etched across his face. He had spent the night in agitation, trying to determine how he could reassert dominance over a plantation that seemed to no longer obey him. He called out, attempting to order the workers into line, but the sound of his voice was weak, hollow against the quiet authority Amara radiated. Amara did not reply. She simply walked through the cotton rows, her hands brushing the plants, her eyes observing everything. The overseer's frustration grew as the workers ignored him, their attention fixed on her subtle movements. One of the younger girls whispered, "She doesn't even speak, and we still follow." Jenkins ground his teeth, recognizing the impossible reality. Authority without force, influence without words. Mid-morning brought the mistress out onto the veranda, her face painted with concern and irritation. She watched Amara silently, noting how even the children who had once cowered at her mother's voice now glanced toward Amara with respect and trust. The mistress opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered. Amara's presence was magnetic, commanding, and it left no room for intervention. Amara allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, though she did not speak. Instead, she walked past the veranda and into the back of the fields, where the men labored under the relentless sun. Here, her influence was strongest. The workers moved more efficiently, almost rhythmically, under her subtle direction. They were not just obeying, they were performing with purpose, each movement precise, each gesture deliberate. By noon, Jenkins attempted another show of authority, shouting orders and moving toward Amara with the idea of confrontation. She stopped, turned, and looked at him directly. It was not a gaze of fear or anger, but of unwavering confidence. Jenkins froze. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely powerless. His usual tactics, threats, intimidation, displays of dominance had no effect. The plantation itself seemed to acknowledge her, bending subtly to her will. A visitor from a nearby estate, who had come to observe the plantation, lingered by the fence line, whispering to a companion. "I've never seen anything like her," he said, eyes wide. "It's as if she carries authority in the air itself. You cannot look away, and yet she does not speak." Amara's attention remained fixed on the fields, her mind working constantly. She was aware of every movement, every glance, every shift in behavior. Subtlety had become her weapon. Words were unnecessary. Her presence alone reshaped the hierarchy. The afternoon grew oppressive with heat, and Amara led the younger slaves to the creek for water. As they bent over to fill their buckets, she demonstrated, with precise motions, how to carry water efficiently and safely, minimizing waste and fatigue. They copied her meticulously, not because she told them to, but because they had learned that watching and emulating her was the path to competence and approval. Jenkins observed from a distance, his face twisted in confusion and growing desperation. Every attempt he made to regain control faltered, each effort only reinforcing the reality that Amara's influence was undeniable. Even the plantation's mistress was growing cautious, realizing that her daughter's attempts to assert power in the absence of guidance were ineffective. Amara had become a force they could not confront directly. As the sun sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cotton fields, Amara stood alone for a moment, breathing in the humid air. She knew the plantation would never be the same. Her presence had instilled a quiet order, a silent revolution. The workers now moved with dignity. The overseer trembled beneath the weight of her influence, and the mistress's family could no longer rely on fear to control their property. Amara allowed herself a rare smile. Today had been another victory, another step in the unspoken war for power. But she also knew that vigilance was necessary. Authority is delicate, and even the slightest misstep could unravel months of careful influence. As night fell, she returned to her quarters, listening to the soft sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. From somewhere deep in the distance, she could hear the faint shuffle of the overseer's boots on the veranda, the mistress whispering instructions to her daughters. And somewhere in the shadows, she sensed the plan forming in the minds of those who feared her, but she was ready. She lay down, closing her eyes, allowing the night to cloak her. Yet even in rest, her mind worked, cataloging, observing, and planning. The plantation had begun to bend to her will, and she would ensure it continued to do so. Amara's journey of subtle domination and influence was far from over, and the story of her quiet, unyielding authority would ripple through the fields for years to come.